When I was 12 years old, a war broke out in my country between Hezbollah and the State of Israel. The war would last for 34 days, as Israel ferociously bombed the entire country night and day. What would later come to be known as the Dahi Doctrine, the flattening of entire urban neighborhoods, was invented during this war. All told, over 1,000 Lebanese were killed, the vast majority of them civilians. By some miracle, I missed the war in its entirety. Exactly one day before it started, I joined my mom for a trip to visit family friends in Damascus. We had no idea what was just about to happen. If we did, we would have taken my brother with us. The entire time I was there, I didn't understand anything about the war. My mother kept me distracted as best she could. She'd wait for me to sleep to watch the news or to make calls back home to check up on family. But one night, I couldn't sleep, so I snuck inside and peeked into the living room where my mom was watching TV. I remember seeing George Bush speaking, who was the president at the time, and I had no way of knowing this back then, but he was commenting on a massacre that had happened in the south of Lebanon, where the Israelis killed 28 civilians in their homes.
America mourns the loss of innocent life. It's a tragic occasion when innocent people are killed. And so our sympathies go out to those who've lost their lives today and lost their lives throughout this crisis. The United States is resolved to work with members of the United Nations Security Council to develop a resolution that will enable the region to have a sustainable peace.
At the time, I believed him. I believed he was sad about what was happening and that he was working hard to end the war. Because after all, I was just 12 years old. I had no real sense of politics. And like most Lebanese parents of her generation, who grew up during the 15-year-long civil war, my mother wanted to shield me as much as possible from the brutal realities of war and siege and assassinations. But ultimately, I was aware of the very violent and chaotic nature of the politics in my region. The whole year prior, there were car bombs going off every other week in Beirut. Actually, my first introduction to politics was in 2005, when the massive car bomb that assassinated our former Prime Minister, Rafi Hariri, went off 8 blocks away from my school. So you could say that politics entered my life with a bang. It was only years later, when I was about 18 years old, that I began reading about the 2006 war. And what I found was kind of shocking, although it might sound a bit ridiculous or naive stating it now. Because what I found was that the US wasn't on our side at all. In fact, like we've seen over the last 2 years, they expedited weapon supplies to the Israelis. They blocked UN Security Council resolutions, and from every level of their government, affirmed Israel's right to self-defense. So I had been lied to, not just by George Bush, but by so much of the US media. This realization came as I began to discover that the United States is an imperialist power, that everything I was taught at school was wrong. So I began searching for the truth and latching on hard to whatever I could find. The height of my inquiry at the time, which totally reversed what I had been raised to believe about the US, was summed up by this line: if the Nuremberg Principles were upheld, then every post-war American president would be hung. The person who said that, the person who I saw as my savior from Western imperialist propaganda, was Noam Chomsky. Which, I know, problematic. But to be fair, well, maybe it's just the one photo. Oh God, is that? Oh God, Daddy, no. Actually, maybe this is a good part to pause. Because I'm sure you're wondering why I've started this video about Tankies with the story of my own political upbringing. Well, in short, it's because I was one for a while. I obviously didn't self-identify as such, because no one really does, but I definitely had certain tendencies and beliefs that today I would categorize as tanky, or at least tanky adjacent. But what does that word even mean? It's one of those words that's used by so many different people for so many different reasons. And for example, you might see liberals use the term tanky to describe anyone to their left. Of this definition, I have nothing to say in this video. Almost everything I want to say to liberals at the moment, I said in my last video essay, How Liberalism Enables the Far Right. Now, as for when leftists use the term, it's a bit different, and I think a lot more valid. If you've by any chance tried searching for any videos here on YouTube, you'll most likely get people who talk about tankies as a source of ideological tension within the left, as authoritarian leftists who fundamentally misunderstand Marx. But there's very little to basically nothing out there about the ways that I, and many others from the global south, use the term. To be clear right off the bat, whenever I've used the term tanky, it's referencing a specific type of self-styled anti-imperialist, mostly positioned in the global north. In my opinion, it has very little to do with different flavors of leftism, but does have a lot to do with a certain worldview. This worldview pushes them to have some pretty wild takes about movements, struggles, and states across the global south. I'm sure if you've spent any time on the internet in 2026, you know exactly what I'm talking about. For example, the recent discourses around the US kidnapping of Maduro and his wife, as well as the protests and subsequent massacre in Iran, are rife with contradictions. Like, at this point, even the Iranian state media themselves acknowledge that 3,000 people were killed in the protests. That's a lot of Mossad agents, huh? So what I want to do in this video is provide a useful definition of what a tankie is, from the perspective of, very broadly speaking, a global South leftist. Not only do I think that'll be a first on YouTube, but it'll also be, as far as I can tell, the first long-form video on the subject since the start of the genocidal war in Gaza and the subsequent global solidarity movement for Palestine. I make a point of noting this because the monstrosity of the genocide and what it has revealed about the world order and the hypocrisy of Western states and media has totally reshaped the discourse online. The genocide has also made very clear the need to develop more efficient forms of global left movement building. In those older videos which I talked about, which are only about 3 years old, tankies sound like a fringe thing, but I'd argue that tankie thought is almost mainstreamified through very large pro-Palestine social media accounts, organizations in the US like PSL, certain high-profile individuals, and lefty content farming meme accounts. I'd also argue that I think this worldview ranges from being a source of distraction to being a potentially harmful one, harmful to leftist struggles everywhere, but specifically to those communities who desperately need internationalist solidarity. And funny enough, one thing I will do in this video is insist that we stop using the term tankie, because there actually exists a far better term to describe this worldview, a term that is much more accurate, much more historical, and that has much more universal application. That term is... You'll just have to keep watching to find out. I'm so sorry to do that. I feel embarrassed about myself. But this is YouTube after all. And speaking of which, I've now opened up a Patreon, so people can support me on a regular basis. If you like this video, which I have put a lot of work and a lot of research into, please consider becoming a patron. Otherwise, I have my tip jar for one-time donations, and both links will be in the show notes below. Like and subscribe, yada yada. That's it. Let's begin. Part 1. What is a tankie? The origin of the term tankie stems from the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, a communist revolution that was crushed by the Soviet army, that is, by Soviet tanks. In the Communist Party of the UK, a split began to emerge between those who supported the revolution and those who supported the crushing of it. those who supported the tanks were dubbed Tankies. And so, ever since, Tankie has been a term used to describe those who dogmatically support whatever the Soviet Union does, and who basically believe that liberation can come off of the back of tanks. You might sometimes hear people use the term tankie to define people who subscribe to an authoritarian leftist tendency, people who describe themselves as Marxist Leninists. But more generally, as I said earlier, tankie mostly refers to self-styled leftist anti-imperialists who support certain governments, regimes, and groups across the world, seeing them as bastions of anti-imperialism. In all cases, these regimes are authoritarian in nature. In many cases, they are capitalist, and in other cases, engage outright in imperialist practices themselves. The most obvious example of all of this is Russia, which I've definitely noticed since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many tankies are no longer able to fully justify or defend it. But their focus is almost solely on NATO's eastward expansion, as though it justifies Putin's imperialist aggression. Because in the tankie viewpoint, only the United States constitutes an imperialist power. Therefore, any government or regime that either opposes the US or is targeted by it wins their uncritical support. And I do need to be clear, US imperialism is a monstrosity on human civilization, and very well may spell the doom of us all. I am so not against people being against the US empire, but it's what often follows that I think becomes quite reactionary. My favorite example of this comes from the novel Beer and the Snooker Club by the Egyptian writer Wagia Khaleh. The book was written in 1964 and set in 1956 in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, when then President Gamal Abdel Nasser began cracking down on local dissent. The main character, a young man who is loosely based on the writer, finds himself in an English pub sitting with two locals. He turns to one of them and asks, "Brenda," I asked, "are you really a member of the Communist Party?" "Really?" She smiled. "Yes, I am. I have been since I was 15. What do you think of Nasser?" "Here's to Nasser," she said, and drank her beer. "And yet," I said, "he imprisons communists." "Yes," John said. "How can you drink to the health of someone who imprisons communists?" She didn't hesitate. "I drink to anyone who deals imperialism a blow." I love that. Because, yeah, it has been a thing for a while. But also, the person there, given the location, her political affiliation, and the date, she is, in the most literal sense of the word, a tankie. But if I'm honest, about a decade ago, I would have been a lot more sympathetic to her viewpoint. So, where did I leave off? Right, Chomsky. I'm going to hold off for now from talking about my critiques of him, only because I want to keep it a bit chronological to my experience. Because when I first discovered Chomsky, oof. I mean, the first book of his that I read was titled On Western Terrorism, which, even just the title alone, subverted so much of what I understood about the United States. To me, at the time, it was a totally new way of seeing the world. Because Chomsky really helped me understand that every US president is consistent in one thing, in their maintenance of the US empire and US private interests across the world. What to me felt like something that only neocons do, like George Bush, Chomsky pointed out that no, in fact, it's what they all do, that Obama was doing it at that very moment. Or, for instance, the long history of US-backed coups in Central and Latin America against democratically elected leftist governments. That was definitely something I did not learn at school, and it definitely wasn't something that I would ever see on TV. What this impressed on me is the fact that so much of the realities and conditions we experience across the global south are a direct result of US hegemony and interference ever since the end of the Second World War. Of course, Israel is a big part of this, since, as Chomsky would often note, it became US imperialism's cop on the beat in the so-called Middle East, after it demonstrated its ability to suppress Arab nationalism in 1967. Now, I personally don't see Chomsky as a tankie. For one, he'd often criticize the Soviet Union and describe it as a state capitalist economy. But I do think there's a whole generation, actually several, who derive a Tankie outlook from his work. Because the focus is almost purely on empire and geopolitics, with a complete lack of local grassroots voices, or the needs and wants of the working class. If you only ever talk about states, about the macro level, you forget that there are people in those states, people with their own complexities, analyses, aspirations. It's easy to talk over those communities when you feel like you understand the situation better than they do. You've got the bigger picture, and they're too in the shit to be able to see it. And I personally noticed a sharp rise in these beliefs around 2015, when Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war on behalf of the Assad regime. With their military intervention, the Russian state also started pumping out so much propaganda to justify its efforts. This was the moment that saw so many Western leftists defending an authoritarian capitalist regime in Syria, which at that point had already killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians in a war waged under the slogan, Assad or we burn the country. Instead of siding with the people, with the workers, with the revolutionaries, people who claimed to be leftists defended a dictator and his imperial master. Online discussions focused purely around geopolitics and war on terror discourses, totally erasing the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary origin of the war. And the thing is, as I pointed out, even Tankies don't disagree that Russia is an imperialist power. This is part of how they write off the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a, quote, inter-imperialist conflict. But even just with Syria, if Putin was really engaging in a war against terrorism, as he and Assad claimed, then why is he so comfortable meeting with Sharia now and striking deals with the transitional government? Well, it's very simple. They still have ownership of their military base in Tartus and other assets across the country. It's classic imperialism. So why do self-proclaimed anti-imperialists often argue on behalf of an imperialist power? One writer who speaks most bitingly about this very phenomenon is the Syrian-British writer Layla al-Shami. In 2018, al-Shami wrote an essay entitled The Anti-Imperialism of Idiots, wherein she writes, "This anti-imperialism of idiots is one which equates imperialism with the actions of the US alone. For this authoritarian left, support is extended to the Assad regime in the name of anti-imperialism. Assad is seen as part of the axis of resistance against both US empire and Zionism. It matters little that the Assad regime itself supported the First Gulf War, or participated in the US illegal rendition program where suspected terrorists were tortured in Syria on the CIA's behalf." It's honestly such a frustrating thing to be confronted with, especially coming from people from the global north, from within the belly of the beast. And if you contradict their grand narrative about you and your struggle, you're fed-jacketed, as in accused of being CIA or Mossad, as I'm sure I will be in the comments of this video. This, in a very odd way, mirrors the very imperialism that they are so opposed to. As al-Shami writes, one of the main ways imperialism works is to deny native voices. In this vein, leading Western anti-war organizations hold conferences on Syria without inviting any Syrian speakers. Everything that happens is viewed through the prism of what it means for Westerners. Only white men have the power to make history. So you might be asking yourself, why are they like this? Well, I think the best way to explain it is by talking about the better term I mentioned earlier. And that better term is Campism. Part 2. Campism, the better term. Campism is the idea that the world is split up into different competing camps. This has different incarnations, historically speaking, but today, those two camps are the imperialists, the US, the EU, Israel, and others, and the anti-imperialists, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, etc. For those on the left, campist thought dictates a kind of allegiance to this second camp, regardless if those states are themselves leftists or not. It's also less to do with their actions or policies or ideologies, but that they are subject to or competing with Western imperialism, and thus forms a kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of politics. Campism as a form of political thought only really emerged following the Russian Revolution of 1917. Before that, the struggle for socialism, here I'm mostly speaking about Europe, was seen as inherently internationalist. As Dan Labotz, a US labor union organizer and academic, writes, in the Communist Manifesto, which was directed to the 1848 revolutionary movement, Marx and Engels proclaimed, "Workers of the world, unite." They believed that workers and the oppressed could reach across their national borders and join hands in the struggles for national self-determination and for democracy and socialism. People in one nation coordinated with those in other countries in their fights for higher wages, for land, for the right to vote and run for office, to speak out, to publish, to assemble, protest and petition, as well as in struggles against tyranny or foreign domination. Socialists understood these as one fight against the residues of feudalism and monarchy, and a still developing capitalist system. But a lot of this has changed ever since, especially with the formation of the Soviet Union. For the first time in history, a socialist party seized state power outright. As a result, Russia experienced a bloody civil war and foreign invasions by numerous states attempting to crush the nascent worker state. And as a result of that, worker and union power started to be sidelined by the Communist Party as it consolidated control of executive power and the state. This was a perfect recipe that enabled Stalin to commit a counter-revolution and seize total power for himself. All of this directly led to the development of Campism. Here again, Labotz writes, through the process that began in the mid-1920s, the notion of international working-class solidarity was replaced by the concept of loyalty to the Soviet Union, and then by allegiance to the entire communist camp. Around the world, communist support for the Soviet Union as the workers' homeland also came to be construed as support for the anti-imperialist camp. And so, when Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with fascist Germany, the party and many communists remained loyal. Then, fast forward a bit, we have the same effect happening when the Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Communist Revolution in 1956. This is precisely what I mean when I say that Tankies are campists. Today, we see the same logic play out when it comes to anything to do with Russia or Iran. It's not that people on the left think that Iran is a socialist republic, or that Russia is actually anti-imperialist, but that they are opposed to the other camp. Or rather, that the other camp is against these states. Therefore, we side with them uncritically. And although the logic is very similar, campist thought has shifted significantly since the fall of the Soviet Union. The Lebanese socialist academic Gilbert Ashar illustrates this exact shift very concisely. Cold War campism was re-emerging under a new guise, no longer defined by alignment behind the USSR, but by direct or indirect support for any regime or force that is the object of Washington's hostility. In other terms, there was a shift from a logic of the enemy of my friend, the USSR, is my enemy, to one of the enemy of my enemy, the USA, is my friend, or someone I should spare from criticism at any rate. While the former led to some strange bedfellows, the latter logic is a recipe for empty cynicism. Focused exclusively on the hatred of the US government, it leads to knee-jerk opposition to whatever Washington undertakes in the global arena, and to drifting into uncritical support for utterly reactionary and undemocratic regimes, such as Russia's thuggish capitalist and imperialist government, imperialist by every definition of the term, or Iran's theocratic regime, or the likes of Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. Building off of my own experience with this type of thinking, I think a big part of it comes from the hypocrisy of Western governments and media. Take, for instance, how enraged they are by Russian bombing of hospitals and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. How they spend billions in supporting Ukraine in defending against Russian aggression. Then, at the same measure, they don't just turn a blind eye, but actively defend Israel when it bombs hospitals and civilian infrastructure.
Selbstverteidigung bedeutet natürlich, dass man Terroristen nicht nur angreift, sondern zerstört. Deswegen habe ich so klar und deutlich gemacht, wenn Hamas-Terroristen sich hinter Menschen, hinter Schulen verschanzen, dann bekommen wir in ganz schwierige Themenbereiche rein, aber wir ducken uns davor nicht weg. Deswegen habe ich vor den Vereinten Nationen deutlich gemacht, dann können auch zivile Orte ihren Schutzstatus verlieren, weil Terroristen das missbrauchen.
What Israel is doing in Gaza goes far beyond what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and the hypocrisy is on full display when European leaders talk about human rights and international law. This hypocrisy is enraging, but also, I think, pushes people towards doing the converse. That is, take their hypocrisy and reverse it. So, if the New York Times stands in solidarity with Ukrainians, but not Palestinians, so too do campists stand in solidarity with Palestinians, but not Ukrainians. Here, I think it's super important to note that the hypocrisy of Western governments and media should not be a guidebook for leftist thinking and solidarity making. And actually, the phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," is very important to focus on for a minute, because it provides very little room for critical analysis. Implicit within it is a rigid binary that I think is best described with its parallel phrase, "you're either with us or against us." And that's actually kind of interesting, because there are so many variations of this exact quote throughout history by a very colorful list of people. From the book of Joshua, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Vladimir Lenin, "Each man must choose between joining our side or the other side." Anakin Skywalker, "If you are not with me, then you are my enemy." To which Obi-Wan responds, "Only the Sith deals in absolutes." Benito Mussolini, "You're either with us or against us." Jesus, according to the Gospel of Luke, "Whoever is not against you is for you." And finally, George Bush, "Either you're with us or you're with the terrorists." I think this historical breadth is one of the reasons why I think campism is a concept that we should familiarize ourselves with much more. Another important reason, as you maybe could tell from the examples, is that campism isn't just a phenomenon of the left. What's often referred to as first campists are those who believe that Western states are fundamentally good and support their efforts to spread their version of liberal capitalism to the rest of the world. Second campists, on the other hand, who are often called leftist campists, support the states and groups that, at least nominally, oppose the first group. And then you have third campists, who believe in the unity of oppressed communities and the international working class around the globe against global capitalism. I've always found that last one a bit weird, because I would categorize that tendency as anti-campist, or at least non-campist. Mostly because it's from advocates of this third camp that we get most descriptions and criticisms of the very concept of campism in general. For instance, in 1940, within the first years of the Second World War, a Marxist journal called the New International published an essay entitled "For the Third Camp," wherein they write, "We reject the basic idea that all variations of the two-camp theme have in common, that the masses must fight under the banner of one or another of the existing imperialist powers, be it the Stars and Stripes, the Union Jack, the swastika, or the hammer and sickle. We say there is in this war a third camp, independent of either of the two warring imperialist camps, the camp of the world working class, cut off from all political control, inarticulate, brutally repressed when it raises its head, but ceaselessly, in ferment, pushing up from below, breaking through the surface to assert its human rights and needs. This is our camp, the camp of the hundreds of millions of men and women with black and white and yellow and brown skins who have no say about whether their country sends them to death. To accept any of the two camp alternatives, however good and noble one's intentions may be, is to give aid to the war makers, since all three slogans are essentially more or less well-disguised devices to enlist the masses under one military banner or another. The policy of the third camp, the camp which fights under the banner of world revolution to overthrow all the existing governments of the two imperialist camps, this is the only realistic anti-war policy. Now, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a lot of people in the comments calling me a Trotskyist for quoting the New International and for talking about campism in general. First of all, I'm not. But more importantly, I have no interest in this idol worship, which feels a lot like the online leftist version of my daddy can beat up your daddy. Politics is not about whose daddy is smarter or better or whatever. But sometimes, when it boils down to it, that is what a lot of campus thinking feels like, whether we're talking about Putin or Lenin. Actually, speaking about daddies, I do need to get back to my story, but I think I'm going to do that in the next section, which I have very subtly titled Part 3. Is Campism Bad? The moment I got over my Chomsky phase was in 2019, specifically on October 18, when I found myself in downtown Beirut, surrounded by tens of thousands of protesters in what would later come to be known as the October 17 revolution. For the first time in my life, I felt part of something much bigger than me, a mass political movement aiming to overthrow the sectarian, neo-colonial oligarchy that has dominated Lebanon specifically since the end of the Civil War in 1990. But what I found was that even though I thought I had radical politics, I felt completely useless. Simply put, I just wasn't able to talk to anybody. My head was filled with the Pentagon Papers, with the Iran-Contra affair, with the overthrow of Allende in 1973, the other 9/11, that I had nothing to say to my fellow country people. I realized in that moment that as far as my local context went, so much of Chomsky and all my geopolitical knowledge was utterly immaterial. I then had to start essentially from scratch, talking to people, going to public talks in the square, following people online, essentially educating myself about my own state, my local ruling class, the history, my society, politics, economics, all of it. I was totally unprepared to actually engage with the movement building happening on the ground, but for the first time felt surrounded by comrades, by organizers, as part of a struggle for a common cause that directly affected our lives. The mismatch of what I learned from Chomsky and what I learned from the streets, from the square, and from local leftist discourse, to me was such an important lesson to learn. Politics used to feel like a purely academic exercise, a thing to study, to discuss, to argue about online. But what I basically learned was that all of that is fundamentally useless unless you can put that study to action. That politics is not just a heated debate in an outdoor cafe or on Twitter, but something you do. It's the messy, exhausting, uncomfortable, and thankless work of movement building, of showing up, of organizing. As in, it's not just all geopolitics. It's lived experience and grassroots actions as well, which requires a whole other skill set and knowledge base. That whole experience not only drove me to focus on local organizing and discourses, where I ultimately felt more useful, but also gave me a new lens to understand other movements and struggles across the region and the world. Campus at the time wrote that the revolution in Lebanon was merely a color revolution, a foreign-backed attempt to curb Hezbollah's political power, which at the time was at its peak. It's the exact same script they're using today to dismiss the protests in Iran. What Campus are asking of the peoples of Iran today is to acknowledge that the US is the real source of their woes, that they should ignore what they see with their eyes, the experiences of their daily lives, and wait until the US empire collapses before overthrowing their regime. Now, so far, I've avoided naming names, because I'm not doing that. I think I'm going to get enough backlash as it is just by talking about this stuff to begin with. But here, I will give an example of a text, which is of course a tweet because so much of this stuff happens in short form, that demonstrates exactly this analysis I'm talking about. I oppose the US empire and the Iranian regime. No, you support the US empire. If you desire the downfall of the Iranian government in today's present geopolitical reality, then you desire the expansion of US imperial power. And the person who published that has almost 500,000 followers on Twitter, which again emphasizes that this is not a fringe thing at all. Also, mind you, that tweet was written during the total internet blackout in Iran, while the regime was gunning down people in their thousands. There's almost a total lack of empathy with the people on the ground, across the country, who are desperate, whose wealth has been plundered, who have been oppressed by this theocratic, neoliberal regime, particularly women, ethnic minorities, the working class. Now, imagine being an Iranian, seeing what you've seen, knowing what you know, then going online to make connections and gather solidarity and support from others outside, and seeing this type of condescending writing about your struggle. The multi-ethnic leftist feminist collective called Roja wrote a fantastic essay earlier in the protests, which addresses these issues head-on. There are the pseudo-left campists, the self-styled anti-imperialists, who whitewash the Islamic Republic's dictatorship by projecting an anti-imperialist mask onto its facade. They cast doubt on the legitimacy of the current protests by repeating the tired accusation that, quote, an uprising under these conditions is nothing but playing on the field of imperialism. But they can only read Iran through the lens of geopolitical conflict, as if every revolt is merely a US-Israeli project in disguise. In doing so, they deny the political subjectivity of the people of Iran and grant the Islamic Republic discursive and political immunity as it massacres and represses its own population. Those who come into the streets are tired of abstract, simplistic, patronizing analyses. They fight from within contradictions. They live under sanctions while simultaneously experiencing the plunder of a domestic oligarchy. They fear war, and they fear internal dictatorship. But they do not freeze in fear. They insist on being active subjects of their own destiny, and their horizon, at least since December 2017, is no longer reform, but the fall of the Islamic Republic. Now, empathy is of course an important word here, one that I actually see being assaulted by both the campists of the left and the right. But I think we're also just talking about reality. One of the main issues with campus thought is that it places the narrative before the facts. So let's take, for example, the assertion that the Islamic Republic of Iran is an anti-imperialist state, which is at the bedrock of the campus narrative in Southwest Asia. It is true that overthrowing the regime has been an obsession of both the US and Israel for at least 2 decades now, that it is subjected to imperialist violence and unjust sanctions. So it opposes the US and Israel. But what makes it anti-imperialist? Does it have the same opposition to other imperialist forces like Russia or China? Of course not. They are its main trading partners. Does it challenge the capitalist mode of production which, as leftists say, is the kernel of imperialism. No, it's a deeply neoliberal economic system with an entrenched bourgeoisie that is closely aligned to the regime, specifically the heads of the IRGC. The Iranian regime is also very cozy with the Gulf monarchs, especially Qatar, which, as far as I last checked, is also not an anti-imperialist leftist state. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not anti-imperialist. It is a competitive imperialist power. Of course, there's no doubt it's one of the weaker, smaller imperialist powers, compared especially to the United States or Israel, but an imperialist power nonetheless. They are not out to liberate us, or help us fight US imperialist capitalist domination. Instead, like all states, it's operating out of its own self-interest. And when the personal risk gets too great, when their bluff is called, they have no problem betraying their main allies. That is precisely how a lot of people in Lebanon feel. After years, decades of grandstanding, of beating their chests, when the moment came, they did not support us. Instead, they watched from Tehran as thousands of Lebanese were slaughtered. All of the myths of the axis of resistance, of these militias mounting an assault from the Golan Heights, of Lebanon being the red line, was bullshit. And so, I can't help but feel like the constant urge to place the narrative in front of the facts leads people to myth-making, to conspiracy thinking. There is obviously a lot of truth to campus thought, as in that the US is an imperialist power, but it also has a lot of holes, very, very deep holes. And those holes are filled not with facts or histories or theory, but by narrative, myths, apologia for authoritarian regimes, and sometimes genocide denial. As I see it, as half of the world is rising up against their neoliberal overlords, and while fascism is in full ascendance in the United States, Western campus leftists are busy online lecturing Iranians and Venezuelans and Ukrainians and Syrians about their countries. I mean, to me, the clearest example of how utterly frustrating these discourses are is that you had people, supposedly on the pro-Palestine left, who were smearing Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian activist who was kidnapped by Trump. Why? Because he opposed the Assad regime. Lest we forget, Mahmoud Khalil was a Palestinian born and raised in Syria. Or this bizarre and super violent campaign against Rosie, a Palestinian woman from Kuwait who has been trapped in Gaza since the war started, who people claim, without any evidence, that she's an IDF soldier, that she's Mossad. Or, for example, this video I saw on one of the biggest pages of pro-Palestinian content.
So what they did is there are hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees in Iran, right? They'll never get Iranian citizenship. And because they don't have paperwork, they're not entitled to free medical, to food aid, welfare, nothing. And they're desperate. Well, those are the guys that the Israelis recruited. It's like, we want you to stand on this corner. And every time you see this general drive by, make a note of it and then transmit it back to us. Here's $100.
I mean, that's a remarkable claim. And so it needs remarkable evidence, which, of course, he provides none. I mean, you look at the caption, and it doesn't even mention his name. So it makes it so hard to understand who this person is, what qualifies him to say this, what else has he said that maybe validates what he says. But the fact is, there are more than 3 million Afghan refugees in Iran, many who fled after the withdrawal of US troops and the recapture of power by the Taliban. And after the brief war between Israel, the US, and Iran, which is dubbed the 12-Day War, the regime in Iran expelled over 1 million Afghan refugees. Making content like this is so dangerous, and it literally puts a target on these people's backs. And mind you, we're talking about Afghan refugees, people who, in just a slightly different context, these leftist campists would claim solidarity with them as victims of US imperialism. But here, as victims of the Iranian regime, they have nothing to say. And so this type of content is what I describe as anti-imperialist brain rot. Because of course, it can't exist outside of Instagram or Twitter. So I know everything I've said might sound reductive, but I really don't see any depth, any of the radical analysis that some of these people claim to have. It's not some variant of leftism, of socialism, of decolonization. They're just influencers with an anti-US bent. They're simply campists with a daddy complex. Part 4. Okay, and then what? So, I have been having some fun using the word daddy, but I actually only partly mean it as a joke. Because I do think a lot of people, including people on the left, have a sort of undiagnosed daddy complex. That is, an appeal to authority of a strong male figure. It could be an intellectual, a celebrity, a historical figure, a political figure, just basically any patriarchal man who we put on a pedestal, or rather, who put themselves on a pedestal and we accept it. But I believe we shouldn't put anyone on a pedestal, not make any individual out to be more than they are. Especially on the left. We have to avoid this in order to formulate clear and principled analyses of the world order, of capital, and of power. And a part of that is you've got to kill your daddies, or at least the hold they have over you. So, on that, I guess I have to share my critique of Noam Chomsky now. One criticism that I'd always heard of him, but always avoided looking too deeply into, is his track record of genocide denial. For instance, the Bosnian genocide. He refused to acknowledge it as a genocide, saying that it cheapens the word, even after it was confirmed by the International Criminal Court. It was only recently that I decided to look more into it, and his reasoning is just so petty. Like, when I look at the actual correspondence, I don't see any of the academic rigor that I had prescribed to him. There was just this stubborn refusal to see beyond his own perspective, and the perspective of a very select few voices that he ascribed authority to, even if they were very shady and discredited journalists. There are, of course, other similar incidents, but for me, from my own personal experience, it was Chomsky's complete neglect of the Syrian revolution that forced me to fall completely out of favor with him. To me, Chomsky had this amazing ability to take a story everyone was talking about, pick out a detail of it, and make clear how that aspect is actually the most important thing. But with Syria, he basically just parroted the same narratives coming out of the campus left, talking about it only in terms of geopolitics, even while acknowledging that Bashar al-Assad was a, quote, monstrous dictator. And although describing himself as an anarchist, he never talked about the Syrian local councils, the radical experiment in democratic grassroots resistance that grew out of the revolution. He didn't care. Instead, he would only talk about Syria very briefly, and when he did, he would defer to widely discredited Western journalists like Robert Fisk. To Syrian leftists, this was a betrayal from one of the most notable leftist figures in the world. In 2022, the Syrian communist writer and former political prisoner Yassin al-Hajj Saleh wrote an incredibly powerful essay titled "Chomsky is no friend of the Syrian Revolution." He writes, "In the 11 years since the start of the Syrian Revolution in March 2011, Chomsky has not written once about Syria to inform his many readers about the country's plight. His scattered comments reveal that he views the Syrian struggle, as with every other struggle, solely through the frame of American imperialism. What's more, his perception of America's role has developed from a provincial Americentrism to a sort of theology, where the US occupies the place of God, albeit a malign one, the only mover and shaker." That last bit is so real, for two main reasons. For one, that kind of validates my daddy analysis, especially if we accept the Freudian argument that the monotheistic conception of God is an extension and universalization of the paternal father figure. And second, Chomsky taught me so much, but the whole time I was reading him, I felt so impotent. 'Cause, yeah, how are you gonna fight against God himself? It's true, he would always end his speeches with a few sentences of hope that these systems and structures are made by people and can thus be dismantled by people as well. But his words, his analysis, never pushed me into action. Quite the opposite. But today, more than ever, to combat the global crises that are imperialism, capitalism, and climate collapse, we need to act. So although I've spent the last hour ragging on campists, I'm very aware that they're not the main oppressors. But I think a lot of campism ranges from a distraction to active harm. I say that because I truly believe that internationalism is one of the most important tools and strategies we have to counter global capitalism and imperialist domination. And campism often makes internationalism kind of impossible. In a lot of instances, it kills the potential for solidarity. On this point, I think a lot about this quote that is very often misattributed to James Baldwin, but is actually from the gay Black American author Robert Jones Jr., which goes, "We can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." This is why it's so hard to engage with Western leftists online as a Lebanese anti-authoritarian leftist, an experience I share with so many comrades across the region. There's so much condescension, a complete lack of empathy or curiosity, and a demand to submit to their narrative. Otherwise, you get called a traitor, a collaborator, or a CIA psyop. I really don't think that white people in the West understand how violent all that is. And honestly, it's just so frustrating that the discourse online gets so absorbed with this stuff, because there's so much that we could be learning from each other's struggles. I remember in 2019 getting tear gassed in a protest and seeing a bunch of protesters rush to the gas canister, placing a traffic cone over it and dousing it with water. They learned that from the Hong Kong protests. Or another example is what we're seeing today in the US, with how much people are learning from each other about tactics to resist ICE and protect their communities from what amounts to occupation by the Trump regime. There's so many incredible experiments happening around the world that are completely ignored because they don't factor into the geopolitical framework. Here I have to say one thing. Those who are opposed to the label campist or tankie describe it as a put-down, as a conversation stopper, as a kind of discursive bludgeon. It halts debate, as they claim. But I'd argue that it is campism itself which halts the debate. There are people who have studied with incredible dedication their struggle, their context, their societies for decades, who are trying to make sense and communicate their analysis. And then in waltz in just some basic interpreter of US policy and totally derails the conversation. And not just that, but demands that their narrative, their analysis is centered. And if you disagree with that narrative, well, you're either with us or against us. So here's the thing. Our authoritarian leaders everywhere are learning from each other, whether it's technologies of surveillance and death, or in practices of enrichment and exploitation. It is precisely the capitalist class that is at the moment practicing internationalism better than anyone else. So, we need to as well. We need to become more internationalist, learn from each other's struggles, and develop solidarity within and across movements. We need to return to the slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all. This means we need to focus more on communities and movements, not on states. This is what is described as internationalism from below. And now, without Chomsky, without a daddy, I don't have all that much confidence about things. I'm not set in a fixed tendency or a static theory of change. But one thing that I know for certain is that internationalism is the best chance we have of survival, let alone of liberation and emancipation. So I'll end with a quote from the manifesto of an internationalist collective called The People's Want, which I think is the sharpest and most pressing text about everything I just described and beyond. Only the people can save the people. We need to give substance to this slogan by starting to build, in the four corners of the globe, a transnational force capable of effectively countering the cold monsters that are devouring our present and future. Building a real force for intervention and mutual aid will take time and require resources that we need to patiently prepare. But it's the only way forward. No real victory is possible in just one part of the world. Empire has established itself everywhere, so it's only by confronting it everywhere, simultaneously, that we may one day share in its downfall. Thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know in the comments if you have any questions or you want me to expand on anything. And if you did like it, please consider becoming one of the first patrons in my Patreon. That's a monthly contribution of as little as $5 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, I still have my tip jar. Otherwise, like and subscribe, tell your friends and family, and stay safe out there. Thank you, and I'll see you all in the next one.